What is the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament? Some Christians believe the relationship is essentially one of discontinuity, that there is a radical break between the two testaments. And so God gave Israel the Old Testament, but the New Testament essentially replaces it. And so we have it in our Bible, but for all intents and purposes, it's been wiped out, replaced by the New, and the New Testament is the only thing that we really have to pay much attention to. The other view is that the relationship between the Testaments is fundamentally one of continuity, that the Bible is one book, not two, and that God gave the Old Testament to our spiritual forefathers, and that the New Testament does not replace it, but is simply built on top of it. The New Testament is built on the foundation of the Old Testament, but does not replace it. And the Bible is one book, not two, both Old and New Testament having equal and full authority in the life of the church and the life of the Christian today. A key verse on this topic is Matthew 5:17. Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." This phrase, the law or the prophets, was the way that the Old Testament was referred to. It wasn't called the Old Testament because the New Testament had not been written yet. And so Jesus says, do not think that I have come to abolish the Old Testament. I have not come to abolish it, but to fulfill it. Now, we can ask, what does this word fulfill mean? And we'll get to that. But the key thing we want to notice right away is that whatever the word fulfill means, it does not mean abolish. Jesus came to fulfill the law. What does that mean? Well, it does not mean this. It does not mean to abolish it. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. This is our first clear indication in the New Testament that the relationship between the Old and New will be a relationship of continuity. The New Testament is not seeking to replace the Old. Jesus did not come here to get rid of the Old Testament. He came here to fulfill it. So given this verse, why do many believers think that Jesus is trying to abolish the Old Testament and replace it with something else? And really a lot of it has to do with what goes on in the same chapter of Matthew, Matthew chapter 5. In Matthew 5:21, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment." So in this discussion of murder, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said." And people read that and say, oh, well, what Jesus is saying is the Old Testament tells us one thing about murder, and now he's going to tell us something different. And so he's replacing the old with the new. Again, in chapter 5, verse 27, "You have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Again, a common misinterpretation of this is that Jesus is saying, well, the Old Testament tells you one thing about adultery, and I'm ramping it up and altering it for everyone. And through each of these passages, in verse 31, you have heard that it has been said, talking about divorce. And in verse 33, again, you have heard that it was said, talking about oaths. And in verse 38, you have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, talking about vengeance. And in verse 43, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. So love your enemy. Each time Jesus says something to the effect that you heard it was said, but now I'm going to tell you something different. And the question is, heard it said by whom? Well, those who view the relationship between Old Testament and New Testament as a relationship of discontinuity would say that, well, you heard that it was said in the Old Testament. You heard it was said by Moses, by the law of Moses, and Jesus is replacing it with a better law here. And what I want to suggest here is that is not at all what Jesus is talking about. He is not attacking the Old Testament. What he is attacking is the Pharisees' misinterpretation of the Old Testament. Jesus is not attacking Moses, he's attacking Judaism, a false religion invented by the Pharisees in the intertestamental period. So if you look at each of these, Matthew 5, verse 21, you have heard that it was said by the Pharisees, do not murder. And what the Pharisees were doing is altering the interpretation of this law, saying that unless you actually killed someone, you weren't guilty of breaking it. And Jesus is saying, no. The original intent of the law includes not only the actual act of murder, but all harm, all desire to harm. And he's saying that the Pharisees are wrong in their interpretation of the law. And I'm going to tell you what Moses intended all along. This law was always intended to include much more than the actual act of murder. Judaism's interpretation of the law, do not murder, is wrong. And so far from attacking the Old Testament, what Jesus is doing is actually restoring the Old Testament, its original intent. He's not changing it at all. On the contrary, he's saying the Pharisees have it wrong. They do not understand the original intent of Moses, and I am bringing that back. Again, this discussion of adultery. You've heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. I mean, you've heard that it was said by the Pharisees that unless you engage in the actual act of adultery, you have not committed the sin. And Jesus is saying, no way. The original intent of the law covered way more than the actual act. What Moses intended all along was that even if you look at a woman lustfully, you are guilty of breaking that law. Not attacking Moses, attacking the Pharisees' misinterpretation of Moses. To give one more example of that, skipping down to verse 38, you've heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. This law, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, was a law governing the law courts. At least that was its intent. And the general legal principle behind it is that the punishment should fit the crime. And as long as the law is kept within the courts, it's a wonderful law because, of course, the punishment should fit the crime. But what the Pharisees were saying is that this law allowed people to take personal vengeance on their enemies. And Jesus is saying, that is not the intent of that law. The Pharisees and their false religion of Judaism that they invented in the intertestamental period, they have gotten this law all wrong. And so I'm not attacking Moses. I'm attacking the Pharisees' misinterpretation of Moses. I'm restoring the original intent of this law. There is great irony in the use of Matthew 5 to support the idea that the New Testament replaces the Old, when in fact Matthew 5 is the most important chapter in the entire Bible, teaching that the relationship between the Old and New is a relationship of continuity, that the New does not replace the Old, it completes it, it is built upon it. Jesus does not abolish the Old Testament, he is fulfilling it. What is Jesus attacking in Matthew 5? Jesus is attacking the Pharisees' misinterpretation of Moses. Jesus is attacking not the Old Testament, he's not attacking Moses, he is attacking the Pharisees' misinterpretation of Moses. Is he attacking Judaism? Boy, is he attacking Judaism. Is he laying into the Pharisees? Absolutely. And why? Because he believes in the Old Testament. He is trying to uphold it. He is trying to restore its original intent. This chapter, perhaps more than any other in the New Testament, makes clear to us Jesus' love of the Old Testament and his resolve that we continue to submit to its authority, that we understand it rightly as Moses originally intended. So many passages in the New Testament, Jesus and Paul are they angry? They're attacking something. What are they angry at? Are they angry at Moses? No. They're angry at the Pharisees. They're angry at Judaism. What are they attacking? Are they attacking the Old Testament? Are they attacking the law, trying to replace it? Not at all. They're attacking Judaism's misinterpretation of the Old Testament and restoring it. So basically every passage in the New Testament that is used to support this idea that the New Testament replaces the Old actually does the exact opposite, because all those passages the author is attacking Judaism's incorrect use of the Old Testament. And I implore you with all my heart to, as you read all those passages where Jesus and Paul are going on the attack, understand that they are attacking Judaism. Judaism does not teach the Old Testament. The Old Testament does not teach Judaism. The Old Testament teaches Christianity, and so in attacking Judaism, they are not attacking the Old Testament, because Judaism does not correctly understand or interpret the Old Testament. Our Lord Jesus did not come to abolish the law or the prophets. He did not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. And part of fulfilling them is recovering their original intent. And that is what Jesus is doing in Matthew chapter 5.